Not many things change in life, and even when they do, people seem to get pretty pissed off about them. So here we are after a lot of Air Defense Force games. We have Air Defense Force Iron Rain, which does take the series in a few different sort of, I guess, threads. I wouldn't say directions, because after playing it for a while at the start, I felt like it was changed too much. But then the more you play, you realize it's more sort of little differences that make the big changes here. And first of all, we have Ukes, which is now developing the game, as well as it being on Unreal Engine 4. And even though the visuals, which have been always outdated, always had a bit of a charm, games like Air Defense Force 5 kind of went past its charm. So it seems like now they want to make the game look a little better, and it does in the Unreal Engine. However, it has led to some performance issues, as well as just maps and enemies not feeling as populated in the world, making that frantic nature of the game a little less enjoyable. So if you've ever played an Air Defense Force game, you kind of know what the deal is. Like, you go into a map and you are surrounded by hundreds or dozens of enemies, and it's just franticness at its core. It's dumb, it's fun. It plays well enough, but it's just one of those games you play to be a bit mindless, but just completely enjoy the whole thing about it. And it's still here, I guess, in Iron Rain, but it has been sort of diminished somewhat by simple little things like when you kill enemies now, they stay there and they still have a physical space in the world, which means you can kind of create a small mountain of enemies, which means trying to get the enemies behind them then is impossible. So it really does end up becoming a backtracking game where you can't really hold your ground because you can't hit the enemies behind, so you've got to backtrack and wait for those enemies to go over the dead bodies. It's such a silly little thing, but I've noticed it kind of happen way too often, and it kind of ends up being a bit frustrating. Beyond that, they've changed how you unlock things. So normally you'd start with a base amount of health, and as you play through the game, the enemies will drop armor or weapons. And each armor would usually mean 1 HP extra. That's gone here, and instead you have gems, and also you use the money to upgrade your health and levels, and upgrading that health will give you new pulls. It'll go up by 100 or a few hundred, or eventually maybe 1,000 or so. And it just sort of, it's weird because the loose system of previous Air Defense Force games always felt like very, like, in a way, superfluous. It was, you'd unlock 50 weapons, but they're all pretty much, like, a lot of them would be similar with slightly different stats, and that doesn't really happen here now. When you complete missions, you unlock new weapons, so it gives you this drip feed of weapons in a very predetermined manner, which is a good and a bad thing, because then it gives you a new weapon to try in the next mission, and in that it sort of mixes things up enough to make it enjoyable. You unlock quite a few different types of weapons, but it just doesn't feel the same, which isn't a good or a bad thing. It's just a bit different. Depending on what PA gear you pick, you have a certain amount of resources you can use to use deployables. This could be grenades or health packs or turrets, and that sort of adds a bit of, like, dynamic to the game, but also kind of detracts from what Air Defense Force is, because in a lot of ways, to me anyway, as an Air Defense Force fan, it's actually not that easy to say sometimes. It's all about just going into a map filled with buildings and destroying everything around you, and it doesn't always happen here. Sometimes you're in big open desert areas, and throwing down turrets and giving you the ability to do it kind of ends up being like a defense mission where you sort of stand your ground and take on waves of enemies. But like I already mentioned, you can't exactly do that when the enemies take up physical space even after they die, which means they get in the way of your bullets hitting the enemies behind. But the PA gear, there are 4 different classes. They're different enough, but they don't exactly do what you want them to do in some ways. So the 4 classes are the Trooper, the Jet Lifter, the Heavy Striker, and the Pearl Rider. The Trooper is your all-round type of jack-of-all-trades style. It has okay health and damage and everything. It has the biggest capacity for the gear, but other than that, it's got a dodge mechanic which can work okay, but also sometimes, like, attacks come from everywhere, so the dodge doesn't exactly do a lot. You can do 5 before the cooldown really sort of stops you from doing it for a bit. The There's the heavy striker, which can dual wield weapons, which is pretty good in terms of dealing a lot of damage really quickly, but also the reload speed is very slow, so if you're on your own, it's kind of not perfect when a lot of enemies are coming running at you. There's a jet lifter, which has flight, which I put in inverted commas because you don't really fly, you sort of glide around for prolonged periods of time. And the Prowl Rider is, I guess, the most different because in it you can use a grappling hook as well as basically get on a giant insect, scorpion or spider or a couple of other ones, and that sort of to me felt like the most different. I also felt like the grappling hook was the better way to get around the map, even beyond the jet lifter, due to its limited resource. The glider sort of, you grapple onto something, once the momentum gets going, let it go and off you go. It's definitely better than the dodge. So as much as the trooper is the all-round guy with the most number to allow for using equipment, it just isn't the best one to use to me. But despite that, none of them are particularly game-changing to the series. And I think that's the thing about this game, is that for everything different that there is, it sort of does harken back to it, but I have a feeling this game was made for the newcomers, the newbies, or sort of to expand the audience of the EDF, because EDF is definitely one of those cult following games, but in doing so I feel like they haven't done enough to bring in new people, because people will look at the game and it'll still look outdated. The performance on the base PS4 is awful, that's what you're seeing here. There's a lot of slowdown. I tried to sort of get clips that didn't have a ton of slowdown just because there's no real point showing it off. And then for the hardcore fans, I feel like some of them may feel like things have been streamlined. Like, you use currencies now, there's a type of different gems to unlock new weapons and vehicles and get more health. And I feel like some fans may feel a bit miffed by that. I certainly did when I first saw it. I felt like that was a real, like, streamline cutback of what the Air Defense Force series is. So yeah, I think if their goal was to make it different enough to play as both new people and fans of the old games, I think they failed on both compartments. And I can't recommend this game, unfortunately. It doesn't do enough for either audience, and in the end it sort of isolates everyone.